Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm excited to welcome guests to the show, Chris Bramah and JB Morin. Chris and JB have been working together in the realm of sprinting and injury risk factors. Chris is a consultant physiotherapist and researcher specializing in biomechanics as it relates to injury prevention. JB Morin is a world-leading researcher in the world of sprint performance and biomechanics with over 15 years of sports science experience, and he's been a multi-time guest on this show. Chris and JB for the episode today will get into the complexities of sprinting as it relates to injury risk and those injury risk factors, and this particularly revolves around hamstring strains. We'll be talking about force velocity profiling, elements of fatigue in sprinting, rotational factors in sprinting, and where the rotational world of analysis and observation is going from a data point perspective. This and much more on the show today. And it was really great talking to these guys. These guys are on the leading edge of research and data collection with sprinting as it pertains to those injury risk factors. And it was great having them on the show. Before we get to the show, I wanted to highlight two of this show's sponsors. The first is the Plyomat. If you're looking for a jump training or testing system, then the Plyomat is an effective and affordable solution. With the Plyomat, you can link not just one, but multiple mats together. So whether it's gathering counter movement jumps, standing reactive strength indicators, or doing things like bounding, hurdle hops, where you have mats at both the takeoff and landing, the Plyomat is an awesome training solution, and you can check them out at plyomat.net. Our second sponsor is TeamBuildr, and if you're looking for a training portal that can get your workouts to athletes either online or in person, TeamBuildr is a highly recommended system, and you can check them out at teambuildr.com. That's TeamBuildr.com. All right, that being said, let's get on to the show. Chris, JB, welcome to the show. It's great to have you guys on. I'm excited for this discussion today. And let's start out by, if you guys want to give a very quick update of basically what you've been up to or what your main research interests have been over the last couple of years. I know we'll be getting into a lot of running mechanics and injury prevention, those kind of things. But just with an overview, starting with some main interests that you have been up to more recently.
Okay, I'll go first. Yeah, so thanks, Joel. Thanks for having us on. So I guess from my perspective, my work is a combination of applied setting, physiotherapy and biomechanics, along with our research. And our research is generally around the clinical use of biomechanics, primarily for running related injuries. So what we basically do on a day-to-day basis is we utilize 3D biomechanical technology to try and look at different running injuries. So we're looking at hamstrings. We're looking in team sports as well. So we look a bit about ACL injuries, and then we work a lot with endurance runners too. So, all sorts of different things there: Achilles tendinopathy, Achilles ruptures, patellofemoral pain. And some of our recent work has then been more around trying to develop and take what we've been doing from a 3D perspective and trying to apply it a little bit more into in-field methods so that practitioners can have a bit of more user-friendly methods. So the current work we're doing, I think you might have come across our recent paper on hamstring strain injuries with myself, JP, Jordan, and Tom DeSantos. So what we're currently working on is trying to look at in-field assessment methods for hamstring strain injuries and biomechanics related to that. And, find ways that we can basically take what we do from a 3D perspective in the lab around injury and performance and apply this to in-field settings.
Yeah, so this is the connection we have recently for the research I am leading here and doing here. We are more on the sprint acceleration performance side of things initially, and which includes also, as Chris said, some in-field method, transitioning or taking the lab to the field, and checking things from a training perspective. What is the most efficient way to train people to improve acceleration performance? And then we've transitioned and connected with some medical doctors and physiotherapists towards hamstring injuries, just because over the last 10 years or 15 years, we've observed that the hamstrings were involved in both the propulsion mechanics and in the injuries. So there has been a meeting point where we wanted to also study that from an injury perspective. So try to connect sprint mechanics, how it's measured in the lab, but also in field conditions, to hamstring injuries.
Yeah, with the it seems like it's two different ends of the spec, or not different, but just two poles of the same thing, basically. And I'd imagine within those, it helps you guys to paint that bigger picture from both the injury side and the performance side. And there's probably a lot of like little connections that can happen with coming at the same thing from different ends. I'd be curious to ask you guys about those data points then. So I think with a lot of these things, it's a lot more complex often than people think it is. I know it can be simple to get it down to a few key things, but what are the main aspects you guys are looking at in terms of running mechanics and injury? So what connections are being made in terms of what's seeing on the field? And I guess some people would say too, can we predict injuries based off running mechanics in team sport? So maybe I'll have that question as well in there for you. Based off of the latest data, what are the big factors that you're seeing in running mechanics that can be recorded? And then what's happening from an injury rate perspective?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, with that question, you started out with the how do running mechanics relate to injury development, and do running mechanics overall influence injury development? Well, I mean, for me, I think if we break it down and really go back to sort of the theories of the majority of running related injuries, is that whether or not it's an acute injury or a fatigue related injury or an overuse injury, the theory behind why those occur is usually on a simplistic basis, is that the applied stress or strain that occurs through mechanics exceeds the demands of the tissue, or exceeds what that tissue is capable of dealing with. So, from a simple acute injury perspective, if the applied mechanical loads exceed the ultimate tensile strain tolerance of that particular tissue, you get an acute related injury. So we see that within hamstrings, we see that within ACLs. But not only acute related injuries, if somebody has mechanics that influence the overall stress or strain on a tissue, ultimately if that's applied over repeated loading bouts, what you're going to get is a cumulative fatigue that will occur on a tissue. And as that tissue fatigues, it will start to be less capable of tolerating repeat stress. So then you get like an acute injury on a fatigued tissue. Or if you look at overuse injuries, it's that cumulative micro trauma that occurs. So most running related injuries are always about this balance between stress and strain that's applied to a tissue and its ability to tolerate it. So it makes sense from a theoretical standpoint. But also, if you actually look from a scientific standpoint as well, there's like hosts or reams and reams of papers that show that mechanics do lead to the development of injuries, whether or not that's hamstring strain injuries, ACLs, overuse injuries in endurance running. There's lots of evidence to show it, both from prospective studies and retrospective studies. And that is definitely something that we see as well, is that from an applied based setting, we will often see that these people and these individuals who have recurrent injuries or experience injuries at that particular moment in time, they demonstrate different mechanical features compared to other individuals. So regardless of how good their tissue qualities are or how strong they are, we're seeing time and time again from both a research and applied sense that mechanics are seen to be associated with injury development.
Yeah, to me, to add a bit, the idea is that there's a very simple, heuristic in sports-related injuries, is that something happened where your system was not able to withstand the amount of mechanical strain that your system had to face. And so sometimes there's absolutely nothing you can do. Like you get a hit, you get some trauma types of injuries. There's nothing you can do. You have a forward in rugby that falls on your shoulders and everything is stretched. Nothing you can do. But sometimes there is a tilt between your capacity and your strain that is favorable and that is manageable. And the idea is that most of the prevention literature so far has interpreted that in a way that was very, very capacity focused. You want to face injuries, you have that strain, you need to increase capacity. And so most of the time that was your strength overall. And we realized that mechanically speaking, there's also a way that you can move, that you can, play your sport, run, exercise in a way that you can reduce the amount of strain. So for the same level of capacity, maybe your gesture, your technique will allow a lower strain. And there is maybe something we can do. So we are not talking much about directly the injury risk, but first about the level of strain. And then all things equal, and this is big to say injury-wise, all things equal, because all things are never equal. But still, all things equal, if you have the same capacity and you can play your sport and move the way you need to move with less mechanical strain, then maybe you're tilting the balance overall in a positive way. So we don't say we need to, zoom out and not focus on capacity anymore. Yes, you need to be robust. You need to be strong to face the demands of many explosive sports. But there's also something to consider is, okay, what's the level of mechanical strain, acute or long-term? And can I reduce it? So that's the main idea.
Yeah. So within that, and it seems to me, looking at all the pieces, it's always like the easiest piece. I mean, I know the data and GPS is complex, but if you can just get a number and say, well, this workload is too much, or that's a pretty simple, there's not as many moving parts once you actually have the workload number, I feel like, compared to running mechanics and watching people run and move and the nuances of how locomotion is produced. As I see it, that is a little bit more complex in some ways. What do you have?
Yeah. I might start with this one because we very simply define that with colleague as exactly what you said, as the macroscopic strain, which means my playing hours, my high-speed running hours or meters and so on. That's my macroscopic strain. And then for the same level of macroscopic strain, let's say that my week as a football rugby player is, let's say, 200 meters at more than 90% of my top speed, which is a pretty simple metric to get. I can have the very same 200 meters and have a different microscopic strain because my body and my lever arms, all the things maybe we will discuss afterwards, puts a different level of microscopic strain on my tissues and especially, for example, my hamstrings. So it means that you need to consider both the level of strain overall and also the level of strain within the system of the players. And sometimes you get some injuries where the level of macroscopic load is not that high, or at least, you feel it's well managed, not too much, not too low, and there's still an issue. So I think this is a good way to figure things out. One is related to the training load, the content, and the high-speed content. The other one is related to the kinetics and the running pattern.
Just to add to what JB was saying there about like the look at into the microscopic aspects and the macroscopic aspects, I think very commonly in applied settings, people, I guess it's a lot easier for people to assess and monitor the macroscopic aspects of things. Whereas if you to like look into the microscopic aspects, you have to take a step back and a bit more of an individualized profiling approach to each individual that you work with. Like a GPS metric or quick Nordboard metrics are very, very quick and easy for you to just get like gross measures and assessments on an entire squad and just a database that appears. But to add that and contextualize that along with like individual mechanics, individual structural factors, individual like changes that occur due to fatigue, these often become a little bit more challenging for us to measure, which I think causes some practitioners and clinicians to shy away from doing it and just stick back to like what is safe. And so then you start to get a lot more focus in on that, and then people sort of fixate on those macroscopic elements. So just to give you like just a bit more of an example on that is like if you think of the mechanical argument, there's always long been an argument that mechanics over strength don't really matter when it comes to hamstring strain injuries. And people might say there's not enough scientific evidence for that. But the reality is, if you look out there, at the way in which we assess these things, so for biomechanics in particular, it's quite challenging for us to assess. So if you think of if you look at the prospective literature that's been done, I think there's only like 4 or 5 studies that have been done on mechanics and hamstring strain injuries, but each one of them tends to find something. Yet using macroscopic elements like strength-based measures is really quick, easy to do. I think from my count, there's more than 30 papers that have done that. So I think what happens then is because methods are more complex to assess and to contextualize this as part of a whole system approach, people look at just big macroscopic things and try to I think sometimes we just shy away from them.
And also because that might be a transition to the work that Chris has started. Also because when you assess my hamstring strength, you have 2 or 3 ways to do it, and you have 2 or 3 main variables. That's discrete numbers. When you ask me to run all out at my maximum speed, and you put a couple of cameras, you're quickly going to end up with 50 variables, and so that's much more challenging to get. The brain thinks with one number from 0 to 10 or 0 to 100, and that's it. And sprint mechanics is very, very, you have different ways to run very fast.
Yeah, oh, for sure. And that's something I'm excited to get into, just because I think with sprint mechanics, it's the easiest, the way, like JB, you mentioned heuristics, the easiest is for the human brain just to be like, all right, well, run tall, high knees, heel up, knee up, toe up. Like the easiest way to make things simple and make sense. But there's certainly more complexity there. And I know we'll be talking about the 3D, Chris, you mentioned the 3D piece as well. And like now you're stacking on another axis to go through. And it is a lot to go through that complexity, especially with, just like complicated versus even complex situations. Within that, I'd be curious, within all that, I am curious, like the research that has been done within the actual mechanics, what are some of the key things that are being looked at, there's data for, that might say, hey, this is something that definitively, if someone's displaying this tendency on the field, like heel striking, anterior pelvic tilt and loss of posture, like those kind of things. What things are you finding from that perspective? If you want to go into 3D too, you can. I figure maybe starting with more of the, the things that people are more familiar with, or the stuff in that I think has been more common, but feel free to take that wherever you like. I'm curious what the research and what you guys are finding from data points that are showing leading to the injury risk factors.
Yeah, I think so. So for me, whenever I think like mechanics and the relationship to injury, especially when it comes from a research standpoint, I think there's like a layer that or a level we have to go through really to think about. So for me, firstly, there needs to be sort of like a theoretical basis for why a mechanical feature would influence like tissue stress. So it needs to like make biological plausibilities, it needs to be biologically plausible first of all. And if we look at the literature, or we look at these theories, there's a lot of theories that make sense of why certain mechanical features would influence tissue stress. And then from a research sense, we've got quite a nice amount and body of research. I know JB's been involved with some, and Jordan Mendegucci has done a lot of fantastic work that is showing that there's strong mechanistic links with certain biomechanical features and tissue stress and strain. And then that final piece in that puzzle is like having those associations where we've got direct links to that mechanical feature being associated with future injury. Now, those things all need to take place. We've got lots of theories, we've got lots of mechanistic links, so there's this biological plausibility that mechanics tissue stress, but we need a bit more work in terms of the proving it's linked to injury. But what we know, and what does seem to be proved to injury, is we've got evidence that's showing associations between anterior pelvic tilt in particular and hamstring tissue strains. So mechanistically, is like the work of Nakamura, which they did some really cool work in the past where they'd use like shear wave elastography to look at the passive tension within the biceps femoris and other hamstrings. And then they would manipulate the anterior pelvic tilt position. And in that paper in particular, they found like just a 7-degree increase in anterior pelvic tilt increased the passive tension of the biceps femoris by around 35%. Similarly, we've got some modeling studies from like Elizabeth Chumanoff and her group that showed backside mechanics or I guess like the trailing limb hip flexors can influence strain on that lead limb biceps femoris by around, I think it was around greater than 25 millimeters. So we've got these mechanistic links there, and then Joe Schumann's and his group of them found greater anterior pelvic tilt during the swing phase of running is associated with the future development of hamstring strain injuries in soccer players. So you've got that nice little link there. And we see that with quite a few different elements. I think there's like altered lumbar-pelvic control, so an inability to coordinate movement of the trunk and pelvis is linked to injury development, pelvic tilt. Even some stuff around overstride, mechanical patterns has an obvious mechanistic link to hamstring strain injury. And from my perspective, what we do is on a day-to-day basis is we'll bring people into the lab who have chronic and recurrent hamstring strain injuries and look at them run so we can quantify what they're doing. And it's one of the common features that we see is these people who will overstride, increase the load on the hip extensors and the demand on the hip extensors. They bypass the ankle, so they're less reactive off the ground. And this can result in not only like an acute injury, but there's lots of ways that could contribute to fatigue over time and hamstring tissue itself. So there's lots of these different features that are out there, and lots of links in the literature. So yeah, plenty out there, really. And I guess like JB's got some really good stuff that they've done in terms of kinetic parameters and profiling as well. I think even using simple infield methods, such as the Pierre Zamazino's force velocity profiling. Again, that's nicely been shown to influence or be associated with future injury risk.
Yeah, the idea of the kinetic. So we need to make the difference between the kinetics, that is the force output of the system when you run, you accelerate, and the kinematics that refers to the segment motion, and both result from and influence the muscles stress and strain, because it means that if you want to, let's say that you want to generate a very high impulse on the ground, you need very high muscle forces, very high, hip extensors, plantar flexion. There's been very clear research on that. And at the same time, if you generate a lot of force onto the ground, it means that your level of force output was high. And so in terms of kinematics, the segments movement directly influence the tension and the length, so the strain in the muscle tendons. And so both are related. And what we saw, for example, with the kinetics was that when people after a hamstring injury, so retrospectively, the consequence of a hamstring injury was that their hip extension function was a bit impaired. And so their maximum force output onto the ground when accelerating was impaired as well, clearly, even after rehab. And so we went to a prospective approach just by saying that this macroscopic factor of how much force output I can generate, because the hamstrings are really involved a lot in that force output, could be an indirect marker of the overall, power capacity of my system of hip extension. And if this is, let's say, facing, this capacity strain imbalance, maybe my force output onto the ground will be impaired. And this is what we observed when prospectively scanning that force output in sprinting over the season in football players, but also in rugby players. We've seen that the players who had a drop in that maximum force output capability of linear sprinting had a higher risk of getting a sprint-related hamstring strain in the weeks or months after the test. And so this is for the kinetic parts. And for the kinematics, there's so many kinematic variables that you can assess that I guess, and Chris will explain the objective of this score is trying to define. We need to simplify things, and we need to go to the big rocks. And in my opinion, there are something like 5 or 6 big rocks. Big rocks means, as Chris said, there's either a very strong anatomical, functional anatomical theory relating and generating that big rock, or some evidence in the research confirming that's a big rock. So trunkling is one, trunk rotation is one, and so on. All the movements that lead to a higher strain in your hamstrings.
I like how you bring up the macro, because to me I get this picture of it's like a magnifying glass, and you can move the magnifying glass around and it's like, okay, this is a problem area, but now that you find it, there might be other little things under that magnifying glass that now you have to figure out more to really do full diligence.
It's a puzzle because I have seen some players, and now I work a lot now with players directly and trying to help staffs, identify things, go to the simple big rocks and so on. And you have some players with pretty low number of red flags on their kinematics, but a good number of red flags on their kinetics and their strength. And you have players who have the opposite. They are strong, they have a good capacity of maximum force, they have a good force production in sprinting, so a good specific force, output, and their kinematics have a high number of red flags. And very interestingly, in my experience at least, the players who have a very low number of red flags, all along the spectrum, they are pretty safe sprint-wise. And to me, it makes total sense. So, of course, it's not, scientific evidence, but it's accumulating field evidence, definitely.
Yeah, the image I kind of get with that description, and I'm sure this isn't totally accurate, but I almost think of like a hill. If you could even think of like the bell curve of, of norms. And it's like being in the middle on the top of the hill, maybe you have decent force, decent mechanics, but you fall too far to the force side where you rely on force. You're a forceful runner. Or the other side where you're just weak. Maybe there could be, that could be a different way of looking at it in some ways as well.
Yeah, I think that is definitely, one way of looking at it. But I think what's really important for us as practitioners to try and consider is the fact that, if we just simply assess these singular things just as like tissue capacity, fitness, various other things, and fail to sort of contextualize that within what they do from a mechanical perspective, we'll often struggle to really understand why they get injured. So like JB was saying, you can have people that are really strong, right? And they fit within normative values for eccentric strength capabilities or muscle endurance capabilities, but they still get injured time and time again. Now, part of that will be because that applied strain based on their mechanics, so their kinematic features, could be much greater. And how they deal with those kinematics from a kinetic perspective will then influence the load that's applied to a tissue. So, for example, if you have somebody with poor kinematics, that leads to different kinetics applied to that particular tissue, they can be as strong as they want, or that level of strength might not be sufficient anymore to cope with those mechanical demands. And that's something that we see time and time again. Like if I give you a classic example of like overstride run mechanics, from a 3D perspective, we delve into both the kinematics and kinetics. So I can take two people with an overstride and see two complete different scenarios that happen as a result. So, one player, for example, might overstride and then have insufficient sort of force generating capabilities to cope with that. They might collapse more into anterior pelvic tilt and hip flexion, and that can apply a greater eccentric load to that particular tissue. Conversely, there might be someone who's got like really high levels of strength. They can cope with that at that moment in time. So they overstride, they generate force through the stance phase, and they keep going forward. But because of that overstride, the kinetics that are applied to that tissue can result in more force on that hamstring for each given stride. So over time, that can result in fatigue and overload to a particular tissue. So based on those mechanics, there's two different requirements on a muscle tissue. And if we just solely focus on strength and strength endurance and how that compares to normative data sets, and don't look at this kinematic and kinetic picture, we'll end up confused as to why they're recurrently getting injured, because we're like, oh, strength values seem fine compared to everybody else. But the demands on each stride during the run are completely different. So I think it is really important for us to think about how we assess those factors as part of that overall assessment for red flags. So, that way you might be able to tick those particular boxes in a strength domain, but highlight big key winners, I'd call them winners, of areas that are going to modify the load applied to a tissue when it comes to mechanics.
Yeah. You have to figure out how much they sprint, let's say, they run fast, because sprinting is not necessarily running at top speed or close. So how much, but not only, then how they do that. And so we have like, when I work with athletes or with Jordan, and so we have like a decision tree, the factors that are here, the ones that we can modify, and we just, check that quickly. It's age, previous injuries, And then you go to mobility, because sometimes it's the running technique, the running pattern is mainly a mobility issue. You have poor ankle mobility that might relate to many of the variables in your stride pattern. And so sometimes you want to coach the stride pattern where you should in fact fix that ankle mobility issue. So then we have, of course, strength. Strength is a factor. So you need to know that. And then you move to the kinetics and the kinematics, and you have a picture, and of course the macroscopic load, that is the overall management of the exposure. And you want to find the main factors that are maybe connected to the risk. And the funny thing is that once you have done that, most of the time, and this is to me a key variable, and this is it's not a fight, but I'm struggling to explain that to coaches and staffs. Once you have identified that, you almost know nothing until you have the behavior under fatigue. Because sometimes you have an athlete with their puzzle, their running mechanics, when they are fresh, and this almost doesn't change under fatigue. And on the same team with the same initial puzzle, you will have some players who are totally different under fatigue. And until you know that, there's no way you can anticipate their behavior at the end of a game, season, intense period, block of training, and so on. So I really wish people assess everything we discuss now also in a fatigue state. And this is a challenge because by definition, to do that, you need to generate a specific fatigue state, or you need to do the assessment in a specific fatigue state. And then the discussion with the staff becomes challenging.
On the level of supplements, Lost Empire Herbs has been my go-to for the last 5 years. As someone who's constantly observing nature in motion to help me understand movement better, so too do I draw from nature in my supplementation regime. If you want to check out some of my favorite supplements for energy, strength, and enhancing the total impact of your training regimen, things such as Shilajit, which has been well recommended by many strength coaches, the Phoenix Formula, which was my original Lost Empire Herbs supplement that really made me a believer in the power of herbalism, things like pine pollen, mushroom tinctures, and more, you can head to lostempireherbs.com/justfly. There you can use the code JOEL15, that's JOEL15 for 15% off your order. Definitely check out Lost Empire Herbs. They're an awesome company and will really help that total aspect of your performance training process. Yeah, fatigue it's an interesting piece because as you were talking before, I was making a few notes. My page is already filled up with notes, so I'm trying to figure out where this was from. But I was writing out like some of the factors, and this was an offshoot of the force velocity profile. I don't know if it was entirely related, but I was going to ask you about thoughts on fatigue and stress, how that plays in. And then I've also heard even perception in the environment, how an athlete is perceiving the environment could possibly play a role in injury if they're not making decisions, if they make a decision, not quickly enough or something like that. I think that was more related to knee injuries. It was a conversation I had with Jeff Moyer, and something I've talked with Darian Barr a lot about is just timing. Like if the timing and all this to say is it's hard to put like a number on, I guess you could just say athleticism, like the ability to move well based off whatever the state of the, your body. If your body is in a certain state, you can adapt and problem solve in that state. And I think that's a little bit harder of a thing to put a number on, if that makes sense. It's something that it's almost like a good athlete. And this is just pure N of one, just from my own experience. I felt like I wasn't injured in sport often. And one thing I am good at is body like awareness, like doing even if it's like rolling on the ground, sprint rhythms and bounding rhythm, like all that stuff has always come very naturally to me. And I wonder sometimes if that helped me to prevent injuries, like just to be able to sense and manage my own body well, regardless of the exact mechanics even. So I imagine that would be something that's hard, but maybe if you see people who do struggle when fatigue in general, if their mechanics fall off the rails, that's like a magnifying glass into that. That's like, okay, here's a macro. Now what's going on under that? But I think that's something that's not as easy to quantify outright.
I think the monitoring and watching the change of mechanics over time is something that is incredibly important, because it allows you to then see how an athlete is going to respond in a variety of different situations and stimulus. So when that environment is a bit more chaotic, when they put under pressure from a performance perspective, or when they're fatigued. And I think from an historical perspective, it's always been pretty challenging to just profile biomechanics and movement patterns in general. And often there's like a lot of subjectivity in that, in terms of what people look at and what people see. So what we've tried to do from a research perspective is develop more in-field applied ways of assessing movement mechanics associated with injury. And the idea here is that then, if we can have in-field methods of assessment that you can easily apply, you can try and evaluate an athlete's movement quality and patterns when they're exposed to all those different stimuli. So when the environment's a little bit more chaotic, when they're under fatigue. And so what that might then allow you to do is identify if there's a specific situation where mechanics become a less optimal, and therefore you can direct those interventions to think, right, well, okay, we need to challenge movement patterns in that specific scenario, be it put the athlete under fatigue and teach them or challenge them to maintain a particular technique, or do that with a variety of different environmental stimuli. So I think those are like really important things to do that in team-based sports are often neglected. But yeah, as I say, I think the challenge has been how we assess that in field. And that's like the main thing that we've been trying to work on, so that practitioners can challenge it across different contexts.
Yeah, I think the idea of Chris of building a composite score is very, very interesting, because it's always challenging and risky, definitely, because you don't want to give you like a A, B, C, D, type of grade, because it's not that simple. But at some point, you will have to go there and to have a simple but wrong but still information, because the good information is almost impossible to get. So you have two options: either you just wait and do nothing, or you try to refine a score, making aware about the limitations and everything. But still, if I am 6 or if I am 1, there is definitely something different. And then the big issue will be to have people understand that if I am, let's say, 6 or 1, that's just, I am using just a Likert scale, 1, 5. Let's go. If I am 1 or 5 in a fresh state, it absolutely doesn't mean I'm going to be 1 or 5 in a fatigue state. And this is a common mistake that we do. It's that we infer the fatigue behavior and technique, whatever you want to put behind, from the fresh state. And my experience is that something really, really changed. And the change is very variable. We are not all changing the same. And we had a study where we did a very simple but well done 2D kinematic study of repeated sprints, very basic. And we observed that on the football players tested, we had at least 3 very big different type of behaviors. Some people who almost didn't change their pattern, and some people who changed in a way that is supposedly inducing a higher strain, which might seem logical, but also some people who changed in a way that might induce less strain. So is it a protective mechanism, whatever? But we had the two opposite changes. And so until you do that, it's not written on the face of your players or on their jersey, So until you go there, there's no way you can accurately estimate things. But you need to know it, because those who have a pattern that is drastically drifting towards more strain, when you add, so the capacity is lower due to fatigue and the consequence of fatigue on the tissue itself, and the strain is higher. So their balance is becoming very, very dangerous. And you need to know that, obviously.
It's so interesting that some players go the other direction. Like you said, some people get better. And it would strike me that maybe those are the people, I'm sure there's different ways to go about how you define this, but they're more elastic. They're good users of elastic energy. And it's almost like when the you could say the frictional, the muscular pieces get taken out, they can run that like more, it's not just tendons, but that, more of the elastic components of the machine, they're more adept at running that. And
they are shifting something. And it's very interesting because there is not many studies doing that, inducing a high level of sprint related fatigue to measure the kinematics. But in my experience, I've been teaching this course for something like almost 15 years now. Every year I have a group of 30 to 60 bachelor students, and I have them through a 12 times 30 meters. So once in their life, they know what's a repeated sprintability test. and I don't film them and I don't study that, but I watch them very, very closely, and some really go towards, more anterior tilt, more flexion in the trunk and so on, more overstriding. And some other ones go more upright and seem to run very differently in the opposite way. And, that's one of the mysterious part of things, is that under fatigue, our body is adjusting, but we're not adjusting the same. So
yeah, even for, I know this isn't so much along the lines of injury, but I can't even help just in pure trainability. I think there's also just to say pure speed and athleticism outside of injury. I think that even gives some interesting thoughts, because I think from a very just baseline perspective, it would be, all right, well, if you want to be fast, only do short sprints with maximal rest. You know what I'm saying? Like, well, what if looking at those people who actually got better under a little fatigue, more elastic, like those kind of things. And I say that as well, just one, seeing athletes who have responded that way, and like looking at athletes who respond better with like more tempo sprints in track and field, for example, more stuff that's a little fatiguing, more elastic in nature, and who does well with that and who doesn't do as well with that. And it almost seems like it could be multifactorial, both from a performance as well as even an injury thought process there.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think movement is massively multifactorial. So whenever we try to contextualize why somebody moves in a way that they do, and in this particular case, like why they adopt a specific mechanical pattern under fatigue, I think there's often that interaction between, well, for me, when I try to understand movement, I try to break it down into like simple elements. And people who adopt patterns based on their structure, so what their natural structure wants them to do, off what their physical qualities are, and then off their learned like motor behaviors, so then like neuromuscular patterns and pathways that cause them to move in a specific way. So it may be that, in some respects, that when we are under a fatigue state, we try to adopt the path of least resistance for us to keep maintaining a movement pattern. So we might adopt a movement to be able to keep recruiting specific tissues that are more favorable for us to keep going. So perhaps the ones that are less fatigue resistant within us, or perhaps just increasing anterior pelvic tilt so we get more elastic recoil of hip flexors, for example. But I think what's like really interesting key in this, if we think those interaction between structure, tissue qualities and neuromuscular qualities, what often we neglect as practitioners is actually teaching athletes what we're trying to look for as the end outcome of a movement pattern. So when they are in that fatigue state, they can then tap into what they know as a movement pattern that they want to adopt. From an anecdotal perspective, if you look at like an Olympic Games final, right, and everybody fighting to the line in an 800-meter race when people are fatiguing, variety of different mechanical patterns will emerge, but certain people will manage to get to the line in the most technically efficient and kinematically and kinetically efficient way to get there. And one of my personal thoughts is, if we can teach athletes to understand what that efficient pattern is, or I say efficient, I say like the most performance advantageous pattern, maybe that they can choose to try and keep consistency in that movement when they are in a more of a challenge state. So that's the bit that I think we miss from a movement perspective, is actually getting people to understand what the output is we're looking for.
Yeah, it makes me think about makes me think a lot about the 400 in track and field, for sure. JB, I did want to ask, I just mentioned this in the notes I had taken, was you had talked about, and I know you've talked about this on a previous podcast at some point. I'm not sure if it was the last one or the one before it, but like using the force velocity profiling and seeing people who were producing less force at higher risk of injury. And I think about the macroscopic lens there and the different components of the force velocity profiling, like just the pure power versus the direction, like the DRF. I'm curious if there's any of the nuance of that, like when you actually go into the force velocity, is it both that they might lack, or is it anything in particular once you're digging in that it's like, okay, this is the main contributor?
Yeah. So when we did, so first in most of in all our retrospective studies, the main variable that was impaired after hamstring injury and rehabilitation was the force output. Okay, so let's say that the maximum force side of the curve, because when you look at the maximum running velocity, it was very close between rehabbers and their teammates who hadn't been injured, very, very close. So there was a huge gap in the initial part of the sprint, which makes sense because if you think about it in terms of, horizontal force production and acceleration, this is the moment where the forward force output is the highest. Because when you run super fast, you still produce some horizontal force, but it's mostly directed, the ground reaction force is mostly directed vertically, and you have just a quick braking and pushing action, but you don't have a massive horizontal impulse as at the beginning. And then that was the main factor. We didn't dig into is it the magnitude of the vector or the orientation? But in our prospective study, we tried and we add all these variables. And again, statistically, the only variable that was differentiating the players with an ongoing risk that was actually an injury in the weeks after or the months after the test, and those who kept playing safe throughout the season, was at maximum force output. So it's definitely the ability of your system to push maximally when you initiate the sprint. There was no link with maximum velocity. Initially, our hypothesis was that if you're able to have a much higher running speed, so your maximum velocity is higher, maybe you're able to put your system at a higher risk of mechanical strain, because it is not proportional, but it's exponentially going up with the speed. And so if you're a slow player, maybe you're at lower risk for that very reason, because and this happens in players aging. Some players get old and get less and less muscle injuries, also because their maximum running speed gets lower. But for the cohorts that we've tested, they were mainly young and so on, and mainly, let's say, homogeneous in terms of maximum speed. It was not statistically a factor. But in my experience and anecdotal experience, we have much more players with an ongoing risk when they are both very fast and very low on the maximum force side of things. I have an elite basketball player that has developed her sprinting skills and sprint power and performance. She was totally injury safe. And after 1 or 2 seasons of really putting her numbers of short accelerations, clearly elite level, she started to get some muscle injuries. And I think that not many things have changed on her overall capacity, but she basically changed the motor. And so she changed the strain. And because she was more performant, she was putting her system against a higher strain for the very same level or capacity, and the balance tilted the wrong way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I know you probably answered it in the you probably already answered this, but maybe if I could just ask you to maybe frame this a little bit in a different way. Is you mentioned those players, like the injured return to play person and the typical not injured, they were getting like the same velocity, but the return to play at a lower force. So my question would just be, and again, maybe you already said this, but what is the strategy by which that return to play player is making up the speed, if that makes sense, like absent of force? Like I'd be curious of that, like how, if that makes sense, like how are they clearing that gap if now they have a reduced force output or reduced horizontal impulse, or however you'd mentioned, like what is the strategy now? Like I'd be curious, like I think about athletes as adaptable. It's like, okay, well, I'll pick a different strategy. And I'm sure, it's complex too. There's a lot of, you put 3D in there and different things. I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
So that's going to be mainly a macroscopic response. In the study where we were able to test players over time, repeatedly after rehab, we saw that just playing football and training for football adjusted the profile, because 2 months after the first test, basically the profile was back as not as it was before, because we didn't have the pre-injury data, but there were no differences anymore. So in terms of strategy, instead of letting time, do the job, you can maybe anticipate that by adding to your rehab some more sprint-oriented work, but some sprint-oriented work that is targeting the entire spectrum, not only the maximum running velocity, but also the maximum running force output. And that might be connected to some resistance, resisted works, and so on. So you just want to me, that's very interesting to target the entire spectrum from low speed, high force to high speed, lower force in terms of horizontal force output.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, this probably is this isn't exactly the same way of saying it, but just another perspective would be people think of running frequency versus running length or something. And if you just frequencied it to get your speed, I mean, it's probably not the same thing, but I know what you're saying. Like if you're relying almost so much on maybe the elastic, the spring static, you aren't getting any of the force like you'd get on a sled or resisted behind it. So maybe it's not the right example, but I was just trying to kind of draw it in a different parallel for people.
It's a very good example. You think, and you need to do an analogy with the gym. What do you need to load your system in a gym exercise? You need some loads. What do you need to load your sprint pattern? You need some loads. You cannot increase the force output in a specific movement, be it a squat, a press, or a run, an accelerated run, without adding significant load.
Yeah.
I think when we look at injured people from a 3D perspective, what you start to learn is like people get very good at compensating. So they try to find a way to perform by utilizing structures and different tissues, from adjacent areas. So you've got this like performance injury paradox, really, where someone will learn to perform but still be at injury risk because they're not doing so in the most optimal way or the most efficient way. So I guess what JB is saying is you've got to be really specific in terms of how we target restoring tissue function for the particular performance.
Yeah, that's what I was sorry, let me say this real quick, because that was the thing I was going to say, is I would wonder if in that return to play group, if there was another strategy they were utilizing in the 3D, in the transverse plane, to maybe get that, that was subtly different or something like that as well.
Not in that study. In that study we did with Jordan Mendigucha, we really wanted to not intervene, to not influence the normal pattern. But in many clubs who are now using this comprehensive approach, there is definitely an intervention that is trying to target the entire, basically the muscle itself and the function itself. And a sprint acceleration goes from 0 to maximum speed and from very high force output to lower force output. And if you want to have a comprehensive rehab, you need to target the entire spectrum. Otherwise, something is going to miss at some point.
Yeah. That does make sense. Even just thinking of the force as, just free sprinting versus something where there is resistance and strength, and just being able to work through the spectrum of that. I did want to get a little bit into, as we go through some of the 3D things. So I imagine there's more research, more work, more observation coming out from observing sprinting from the front and rear view, and either from a injury prevention or a performance perspective. Either or. Just curious what you guys are seeing there, studying there, and what are some topics coming up on those lines of thought.
Well, from my perspective, like what we're trying to do at the moment is we've got lots of 3D data on injured athletes, particularly like hamstrings is one of the things. But what we're trying to do is, and the current work that you will see come out, is more of that in-field 2D methods of assessment and how that relates to hamstring strain injury function. So while I love 3D, right, and that's what I spend my day doing, and I think it gives us this really like detailed view of individual performers, I think we definitely need to be able to take a lot of these concepts into field. So the work that you will see is our method that JB alluded to before, or mentioned before, which is our composite score that we're using to sort of quantify the overall quality of someone's sprint running mechanics and its association to future injury development. So, one of those two papers is in review at the moment. The other one is still like in data collection, but effectively what we're finding is that we can use in-field methods of quick assessments to get an overall idea of the quality of someone's running gait, and this is seeming to relate to injury development, which could be a nice way of us identifying people who we want to intervene with on a movement-based perspective early on if we want to try and prevent injury. So that's one of the things we're doing from a research perspective, but as I say, that's like 2D, not a 3D perspective. So I'm quite keen on thinking like, look, I love 3D, but I also need to think, how can we apply this more into the field?
And I don't think, from a methodological perspective, I don't think many of your listeners and readers and understand how tough, complex it is to do quality 3D motion capture. People just say, yes, let's 3D. it's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
You want to have a 3D motion capture of someone running fast, you will be able to measure only 1 or 2 steps, or you have a huge camera set that's only 1 or 2 places in the world, and for 2 seconds of sprint, you're gonna have hours of work. And so no, it's not 3D or 2D. It's 2 different worlds. And my option is that we need to work to get that 2D approach in 2 different dimensions, complementary and robust enough to identify things in field conditions. But we also need to work in our lab, and this is what we are going to start now in this winter, on some systems that would eventually allow some easier and more direct 3D approaches. And there's some markerless systems. Yeah. People are developing things with AI. At my university now, there's a vision lab that is working on identifying segments and so on, but that's 10, 20 years from now. So 3D is it's a very, very, very cutting edge approach.
Yeah, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that one of the reasons why we see so limited work come out in terms of showing mechanics influence injury development is the time it takes to conduct an assessment. I mean, I first started playing with 3D back in 2010. I remember for one individual person, it would take me an entire day to process the data. And now we have it like pretty swift and quick, but still it's 2 hours for an individual assessment and can take multiple hours after that to process the data as well. So it's one of the big challenges.
Yeah, and so people who are bashing studies with 3D kinematics and prospective cohorts of 20 guys and 4 injuries are totally wrong, because they don't understand that this is already a huge feature in terms of measurement. Getting some players to spend hours at the lab, getting their markers set and so on, warming up, running, then monitoring them down the season is a huge feat. It should be applauded, not mocked, definitely. And of course, when you want to have a club, monitored over time, or you need 20, 30 injuries to think correctly in terms of statistical power and so on. So if you want 30 injuries, you need to assess 200 players, and it's almost impossible. And of course, it's never going to be your EPL club or your elite club. It's always going to be some lower level people, because they can or they accept to, and it's definitely a challenge now.
It seems like something that almost it would be exponential, like as you're describing it. It's like it's not just 1 and 1; it's 1 times a lot. Is it kind of like that? I mean, not to necessarily get a bunch into the data collection process, but I am curious.
Yes, but A, it doesn't mean it cannot be done at some point, and B, it doesn't mean it is a reason for not doing it or finding that not interesting. Sometimes what counts cannot be counted. This is the famous quote of Einstein. So
yeah,
it doesn't mean it doesn't make sense. It just means it's super difficult to assess correctly.
Oh, for sure. I know for myself, watching just sprinting from the front and rear view, which in itself, if your observation point is actually still kind of a 2D point from observation, because now you're just watching the frontal plane in 2D in some sense. So it's like that full 3D, and that's just what intrigues me about the human coaching eye, like a really well-trained coaching eye who watches like an athlete sprint past what they can gather versus data points. You are watching the 3D in action. But as you were talking, JB, about the force deficit, I was thinking about just even Julian Pinot is a strength coach who's been on the show and talks about internal and external torque chains, basically like all the torque that moves the body towards from the inside to the outside or the outside to the inside. And I just couldn't help but think, I wonder if there's something there, but then to actually go in and where you see the marker change, that sounds like it is a lot. And so it'll be interesting once that data does start to become a little easier to manage.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so just a couple of things left here. And maybe these are a little bit different. And I know I want to get to the foot first. JB, you've been talking about pieces of the foot as it pertains to just sprint performance, not so much maybe injury prevention. But I'm curious what you've been going into there, like links with the foot and everything that has to do with sprint speed.
Yeah, so the overall idea was to understand that the foot is the last point of it's the only point of contact between yourself and the ground. So all the force you generate wherever it is transmitted to the ground at the foot. So by definition, that's a point in the chain that's very likely important. And we have designed at my lab with a PhD student some very specific devices to quantify the foot strength, directly or more directly than what was done. And we did two studies. One was a cross-sectional study in high-level people involved in very powerful sports, tennis, basketball, football, and so on, to see if there was some correlations between their foot strength capability and their accelerating, cutting, jumping movements. And the second study that is ongoing now is an intervention study. So we wanted to see if improving the strength of the foot through a very specific intervention was also improving some of these performances. So we are now in the core of the training study. And the idea is that in the correlation, so the paper is in review now. In the correlation paper, we found some links between some very specific type of foot strength and foot morphology, and some mechanical features of the acceleration or cutting movements and so on.
Yeah. What so in terms of like the performance, like any performance correlations, I mean, I know the foot's been studied as being the forces going through the ankle joint being so massive. Any sort of training outcomes or thoughts that are coming out of that?
So one of the main, and I really encourage people reading so the name of the students is Romain Tourillon, and he has already written some pieces like in blogs and the overall idea is that our foot strengthening protocol is a bit different from what you see in the literature. There has been some great foot strengthening studies showing some reduction in the running related injuries and so on. But here our protocol is really, really, really targeting some loading of the system. And to tell you what we do, we use some exercises where we really load the system. It's not only just, flexing, extending the toes. We have some loads, and after some sessions, our participants get DOMS. They get muscle pain just as when they do their very heavy lifts at the gym. So it means that we have a significant overload of the muscle strength, the foot muscle strength, and I think that might be a big difference with previous protocols.
Gotcha. Yeah. So we're typically, a lot of it would be just more maybe general calf instead of the actual really digging into the foot muscles.
Yeah. And we try to, our exercises try to target more the foot than the ankle, segments, even if obviously some exercises involve jumping and so on. But yeah, it's much more foot oriented than plantar flexion oriented.
Yeah. Do you feel like that that's kind of where a lot of the lower leg like strength and performance is kind of going into more, or at least a lot of it's going more into intrinsic foot strength more so now?
I don't know if it's a trend or whatever, but all I know is that if you take the entire, strength literature and practice related to locomotion type of sports, I think the foot and the ankle was the forgotten piece of the puzzle compared to hips or knees. Mm-hmm. If you compile the amount of literature and the amount of practice around the different joints in the lower limb system, definitely the foot and ankle is there's a field of research and practice to develop. I think my feeling is that I was an athlete and a track and field coach. My gut feeling was that we thought it was it's there. We don't need to specifically focus on that because we are always exercising on our feet and so on. But no, it's there. But you need also to focus on it specifically.
Yeah, it definitely is. It definitely is possible to do a lot of lower leg training and miss the intrinsic foot. Like a lot of athletes will not get the same effect that others will, for sure.
Totally.
So,
and because you're always pushing on your feet and they are stimulated. The problem is that they are, just in the passenger seat of the training car. Let's have this analogy. You need to focus on them driving sometimes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Without question. I know that's been a huge part of my own journey in the last, really 10, but especially in the last 5 years. And, I was going to, in finishing this up, I was going to ask you, Chris, about the ACL link. But right before we get to that, I actually saw this note, and I wanted to get to this note just in light of 3D. I forgot to mention it. JB, you had mentioned trunk rotation as an injury risk, so that I just couldn't help but think of that and how that might play into some of the 3D pieces or just rotational pieces. I was going to ask you if you wanted to go into that a little bit more, like the trunk rotation. You mentioned forward trunk lean, but I hadn't heard much about the trunk rotation in that aspects of the running injury and the hamstring strains and things like that.
Yeah, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I'm more than happy to go into a little bit of that. I think we focused a lot on like specific patterns of forward lean, pelvic tilt, and things like that. But the trunk rotation for me as well is, if you think of the anatomical links between those tissues across the trunk and how they connect into the hamstring, particularly how they connect into the pelvis, the sacroiliac joint, into the hamstrings. If you have altered or excessive trunk rotation, you're going to start to wind up these fascial tissues that all connect and interact between one another. So first of all, you're going to start to then increase the strain on those tissues in that lower limb. And from a practical standpoint, if you were to like just do a normal hamstring tissue stretch and then add in your own trunk rotation, towards that side, you feel the strain and the stress go right up. So it increases the fascial stress on those particular tissues. And then again, if you look back at some of the modeling work from Elizabeth Chumanoff, they found in particular that the oblique musculature has a direct influence on reducing hamstring strain. So what this is in effect, my interpretation of this is the better functioning oblique musculature, the more controlled your trunk rotation, and therefore the less fascial strain and the less tissue strain you get applied to your hamstrings. So that's one of the things that we always assess and look at with people. And if I'm doing that from a 2D perspective, one of the simple cues that we've started to say to practitioners to look for is if you see athletes who have big arm movements, and if you're, big exaggerated arm movements, and if you're looking from the side, one of my cues is you're looking from the side and you can see the opposite armpit, they've got poor trunk rotational control, and that's likely to influence that tissue stress and strain. And we see it across multiple injuries as well. Like, as soon as you stand on one leg and hit the ground and that force is going through the limb, that torsional control at the upper body is going to have a direct influence on the force distribution at the lower limb. So we see it in chronic shin injuries, Achilles injuries, foot injuries. It's a real big thing that I think we should consider, really. It's quite an easy thing to do.
My experience is that you see this lack of torsional control even in some athletes with very high numbers of, lower limb strength. You have very good squatters, very good people at the press. You do some, torsional rotation control tests, clinical tests, very basic tests, and you see, wow, there is something missing. So, yeah, you need to assess that. Yeah.
Yeah, on that, like further to add to that, one of the big things that we see is like, even when we assess players, you can have people come in and they have like the most defined abdominal musculature. Mm-hmm. They can hold planks for the longest time you've ever seen. Yet dynamically, you watch them move and they can't control rotation at all. So there's this big piece in that puzzle that static-based training and the old, McGill type approach is great for physical conditioning, but does not necessarily transfer to the dynamic movement. And I always think that's a big piece of the puzzle that's missing, is like how we train an athlete's ability to control trunk movements in dynamic, fast-paced tasks.
Yeah, the obliques thing is so key, I feel, because as I've become more attuned to rotational running, incorporating that in training programs and things like that, as well as even just like using the Lila Exogen, which is like the little micro weights, which I use myself, I'll do different setups where I'll have it kind of spiral and make my shoulders and legs kind of spin opposite more. It increases that spiral. And I feel the muscle working the most to try to fight over rotating is the obliques. Like, it's like the only time I feel like, man, I really feel my obliques firing up. But it feels good because at the same time, my glutes are like kicking harder because they're really linked together. And it is like, in watching and coaching club track, like with youth, I saw this a lot. I saw a lot of kids like ages 8 to 14 who actually ran very well. But then you'd see, for every one kid who ran very well, you'd see another kid whose trunk just wasn't connected. And like it fits with what you said, the overstriding, like back to like the timing and is the body connected and timed up? And I'd also get kids who, as opposed to maybe what you said, you get those kids with the long, straight arms, but you'd also get kids who almost had arms the other way that were too tight, but then they made up for it by the elbows just went back and forth. I'm demonstrating this on the screen. No one can see it, but people probably see it where it's like you can almost go both ways. I've seen with younger athletes a big tendency to almost ball the arms up too much and then just kind of like, and then over rotate like that versus that balance between the shoulder axis and the hip axis that can work in that timed unit. I'm glad you mentioned that because I think that is, with the complexity of 3D, I do think that's a piece that still can be a little macro. It could still be relatively understandable, just in observation. So I'm glad I got back to that rotation piece of the trunk.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that you can get from visual observations if you know what specific parameters that you want to look for. And I think it's key for people to remember as well, like there's a strong interdependence between different mechanical parameters. So what I always say is like if one mechanical parameter that you do wrong might have a knock-on effect for subsequent others. So, you brought it back to the overstride, but if you overstride to continue to move forward, well, first of all, you're landing with your pelvis already rotated away from that limb. So you're going to have to spin that pelvis towards the limb to keep forward progression. So sometimes, and vice versa, if you're rotating excessively, that can influence where you put the limbs on the ground. So I think there's some mechanical parameters that can be easily visualized, and I think it's important to try and, try a variety of different cues and target your focus to these different parameters, because if you improve trunk rotation, you might have a beneficial effect lower down. Same as if you improve sagittal plane mechanics in terms of getting the foot underneath the hips, you might improve the rotation on the top.
Yeah, and all these muscles we are talking about have a common point. They have a pub where they all gather and meet. It's the pelvic bone, which means that all the muscles' actions influence through their attachment to the pelvic bone motion itself, positively, negatively, and so indirectly the hamstrings, because they also attach proximally to the pelvic bone. And so it's like a turning point there.
Yeah, with what you were saying, JB, and then Chris, you mentioned like that if you over rotate, it makes me think of like the fascial or the eldoa stretching that you do, and you feel as you twist more, you feel the whole line just get, and I mean, in some ways it's a good thing because your body's interconnected and it can manage and mitigate stress, but if it also makes you think, if I turn too much too fast, it almost makes me, I don't want to try this, but to go and sprint and I'll intentionally like just go, crazy with my shoulders to see how I feel. Probably not good, but interesting. With that way.
We have many, now with the development of in-game videos, we have some studies checking the mechanisms of injuries during games. And we have many, many examples of slow motion videos of players, running fast and getting an excessive trunk rotation due to an opponent grabbing their shoulder and so on. And that's a very high level of tension on the opposite side. So.
Yeah, it makes me think even as well. I've seen this in some of the Franz Bosch, like rugby players doing this, where they would run. They're like running over maybe mini hurdles, and I don't know if they're holding a ball, maybe they are, but they're leaning to the side while they do it as well as like a robust running protocol. So it also makes me think about that maybe as a chance to also build a little bit of like you're stressing your hamstring now in a different way in a controlled environment where you're not like, running into people and stuff like that. So it also makes me think about how that could be a positive as well for not just, being able to run and turn, but also maybe the resiliency that comes behind it as well, or comes with that.
Agree.
But I think that's I know our time's running out today for the show. Do you guys have any closing questions, any studies you're working on that are coming out soon that you want to direct people towards, or any closing thoughts today?
So some studies coming up with Jordan Mengucci as the main author on it's very cool because his science goes from cadaver preparations to test, the link between the pelvic position and the hamstring strain, to football players playing football and estimating their kinematics and straining the muscles during football plays. And I think that's the most exciting part of things coming up.
Yeah, we've got hopefully this will get through the second round of reviews at the moment, but sprint mechanics assessment score will hopefully be coming out nicely soon, as well as we've also got some novel methods of soleus muscle force strength testing on force plates led by Dr. John McMahon. So yeah, a couple of different things on assessment of sprint mechanics and assessment on force plate based tests. So keep an eye out for those.
Yeah, that sounds good. Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much, guys. It was wonderful talking to you. I learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to getting the show going. So thanks, Chris and JB. I appreciate your time.
Good, as always.
Yeah, you're welcome. Nice to catch up with you both.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the podcast. I'll see you next week.